Hi, it is noon. Thanks everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Manomet's Small Sit virtual series featuring Liana DiNunzio, one of our shorebird biologists. If you're new to Manomet Conservation Sciences, a little background on our organization. We use science and collaboration to reverse shorebird decline, promote coastal resilience, and educate and inspire the next generation of conservationists across the Western Hemisphere. And if you are a friend, a volunteer, trustee, counselor, or donor to Manomet already, then thank you. It's only with your support that we can continue to get our boots muddy or sandy, doing hands-on science in collaboration with local partners. And just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. First, we would love attendees to type into the chat where you're all zooming in from. We have a good number of attendees today. And then after that, we're going to reserve the chat for any tech issues you might be having. Let's see. And also, we welcome your curiosity. So please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and Liana will be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation as time allows. A little background on Liana. She joined Manomet's Resilient Habitats team as a shorebird biologist in 2023. Her work focuses on improving our understanding of how shorebirds use the Massachusetts coast during migration in order to guide our conservation efforts. She's here today to share the team's work with Whimbrels on Cape Cod here in Massachusetts. Liana, take it away. The floor is yours.
Hello, can you see me all right, Jean?
Sure can. You're good to go.
All right, welcome. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now. Is that looking all right, Jean?
Looks great. Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us here today to learn more about the Whimbrel of Cape Cod and beyond. I'm so pleased to be here to share their stories. Okay. So I know there's probably many longtime Whimbrel fans in the audience, especially since they're one of Manomet's flagship shorebird species. But for those of you who aren't acquainted, I'll give a brief background on them. So meet the Whimbrel, or Numinius phaeopus. They are part of a group of shorebirds known as the curlews, and they're the only curlew species that can still be found in Massachusetts. So like other curlew species, Whimbrel have brown plumage with a little bit of mottling, and their characteristic long down-curved bills. And these bills are specialized for extracting hard-to-reach food items, like crabs from their burrows, or maybe even blueberries from hard-to-reach branches. Some other characteristics of the Whimbrel are that they are fairly large for a shorebird. They're about crow-sized, and they have this striking and distinctive whitish eye stripe. So Whimbrel have a global distribution, as you can see in this map, and there are 5 subspecies worldwide. Today we'll be focusing on the Hudsonian subspecies, which occurs in the Americas, and we're particularly going to be focusing on the populations that use the Atlantic flyway during migration. So for these populations, the birds breed in Alaska, in the Northwest, and Hudson Bay regions of Canada, as you can see in the orange section of the map. After the breeding season, so like in late summer and into the fall, they'll start their migration south through the Atlantic flyway to their non-breeding grounds along the north coast of South America. After they spend the winter there, they'll head back north to the breeding grounds in the spring. And they'll either do this through the Atlantic flyway once again, or they'll cross the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico and catch the mid-continent flyway up to their breeding grounds. And it's important to note that these birds do need to make several stops to rest and refuel along these journeys, and we call these sites stopover sites. And if they have to spend an extended period of time at one of these stopovers, like say a few weeks, we typically refer to them as staging areas. So you'll hear more about those later. So like many shorebird species, Whimbrel are unfortunately in decline. There has been evidence of decline reported from their Hudson Bay breeding grounds, stopover sites along the Atlantic Flyway, and their non-breeding grounds in South America. So the main causes for Whimbrel declines are still not fully understood, like where in their annual cycles they're facing the biggest threats, or which life stages are the most impacted by these threats. We have, however, identified some potential threats to Whimbrel. This includes hunting, which is still legal in some Caribbean and South American countries. It's no longer legal in the US. Also, habitat loss and degradation due to development and climate change impacts, and threats from other human-caused disturbances. One example could be from energy development, both for oil or offshore wind. So Manomet and our partners across the Western Hemisphere have been working to better understand the main drivers of Whimbrel population decline. This is so we can address these causes and improve Whimbrel numbers. And a Whimbrel working group has been established so we can better coordinate these efforts. And members of the Whimbrel working group have been researching Whimbrel for quite some time now to better understand their life cycles and to identify important Whimbrel sites. Once we identify these important sites, we can assess them for threats and understand how these threats are impacting the Whimbrel populations. And all this research will contribute to a flyway scale conservation plan that will focus on alleviating threats and improving habitat at the most important Whimbrel sites throughout the Western Hemisphere, with the ultimate goal of reversing Whimbrel population decline. So one of the ways that Manomet and our partners have been learning more about the Whimbrel life cycle and the important sites that they use is through tracking studies. So this map here shows some actual tracks from real life Whimbrel that have been tracked over time. And it's data like this that Manomet uses to identify the most important sites for Whimbrel so we can really focus our conservation and research efforts. So Manomet's currently working with Whimbrel throughout their range, from their Arctic breeding grounds to their non-breeding grounds on the north coast of South America, and important stopover sites in between, like the Georgia Bight, the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Texas, and of course, Massachusetts. So this is where our Cape Cod Whimbrel story begins. So Cape Cod is the Whimbrel hotspot in Massachusetts. As I mentioned earlier, Whimbrel use Massachusetts, particularly Cape Cod, as a stopover site to rest and refuel during their southbound migration. So they're typically on Cape Cod in July through October. While they're here, they use habitat such as salt marshes and beaches, and they enjoy the local seafood here, with their favorite being fiddler crabs. And here's a close-up on those tasty little morsels. So some of the earlier records of Whimbrel in Massachusetts are from hunting journals from the 1800s. And you can see a little snippet of one in that top picture. There are some really interesting observations that can be gleaned from these records. Like there's one entry that notes up to 1,500 Whimbrel on Nantucket and Tuckernuck Islands, which are just off the coast of Cape Cod. And there's other observations about Whimbrel using Massachusetts during their northbound migrations, which doesn't happen anymore. They're only come through during the southbound migrations now. It is, of course, now illegal to hunt Whimbrel in the US. So we monitor Whimbrel numbers on Cape Cod by conducting nocturnal roost counts. So nocturnal roost is the place where Whimbrel gather to spend the night. These are relatively isolated areas like islands where the Whimbrel can be safe from predators that are more common on the mainland, like owls or mammals. These also make for easy places to count Whimbrel because they all gather in a group and they're fairly visible, as opposed to being spread out throughout the salt marshes during the day. So Whimbrel roost counts have been conducted on Cape Cod since the 1970s, with a focus on adult Whimbrel and Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge. So these counts were conducted almost annually from 1976 to 2005, with a high count of 701 at one roost in 1999. And Manomet resumed these counts in 2019, and since then, there's been a high count of 244 at one roost in 2020. So just based on these roost counts, there's been about a 65% decline in the Whimbrel using these roosts. And this is actually a similar rate of decline as other stopover sites along the Atlantic coast. So as I mentioned, those roost counts focused on adult Whimbrel on Cape Cod, but you can actually also find juvenile Whimbrel here. So the adults will be here in July and August, typically, and then the juveniles will be here between September and October. And the reason for this separation in their scheduling is that the adults will leave the breeding grounds before the juveniles. So as soon as they're young or self-sufficient, the adults will head south. And this means that these juvenile birds are left to navigate their very first migrations without parental guidance, which is incredible. They only rely on their internal navigation systems. So aside from timing, you can also tell adult juveniles apart from juvenile Whimbrels by their plumage. So you can see the adult, and that left-hand photo has a more worn, uniform brown color to it. And the juvenile on the right-hand photo has nice, crisp, fresh plumage with these beautiful cream-colored spots all over its back and wings. So until about the last decade, most of the Whimbrel research has focused on adults, and little was known about these juvenile Whimbrel in their first years of life. And this period of time for them, just in general, is a very vulnerable period in any bird's life. And it was also a missing piece to our understanding of the Whimbrel life cycle. So in 2015, Manomet launched a study on juvenile Whimbrel, and we had the goals of filling information gaps on their migration, their ecology at stopover sites and the non-breeding grounds, and their survival. And in order to collect this information, we deployed tracking devices on juvenile Whimbrel caught on Cape Cod. And we chose Cape Cod because it was, number one, a reliable stopover site for these birds during their first southbound migrations. And the Whimbrel habitat here is a lot more accessible than, say, the breeding grounds or some of the northernmost stopover sites for these birds. So that played a factor as well. So the first step in tracking birds is you first have to find them on the ground and catch them. So here is a map of our study sites on Cape Cod. Birds were typically caught on their foraging grounds, which include salt marshes, as you can see in this photo. And the birds typically hang out along the muddy banks of these tidal creeks, which you can also see in that photo. This is where they can find the most fiddler crabs. So once we figure out where the birds are foraging, we deploy some traps, and these consist of lines with small monofilament loops on them. So we put that where the birds are feeding, and then as the birds come walking through, feeding on fiddler crabs, if their foot goes through a loop, it tightens around their leg and the bird is trapped. And then a Manomet biologist hiding nearby will run out and retrieve the bird. After the bird is retrieved, it'll be measured, banded, and then fitted with a tracking device. So from 2015 to 2022, we deployed these tracking devices on 8 juvenile birds. And these tracking devices consist of lightweight solar-powered transmitters. So they're able to collect location information on the birds and then transmit this information to the Manomet biologists using either a satellite or cellular network. So all the biologists have to do is log on to their computers and they can see where the birds are in almost real time. It's pretty amazing. So these transmitters are attached to the bird using leg loop harnesses. So the harness kind of fits around the bird's legs, similar to a human climbing harness. And the transmitter fits right on the bird's back in between their wings. This way, the little solar panel can still get light, and it also doesn't interfere with the bird's movement or flight. And I will just point out that all this work is being conducted by highly trained biologists with all the special permits they need, and they always prioritize the welfare of the birds. And you can see some really good photos of little satellite transmitter on that bird's back. And there's also a little antenna that will stick out that you can see in the bottom photo. So once the birds are safely released back into the wild, we were able to follow these birds' daily movements on Cape Cod. So they transmitted from Cape Cod up to 19 days. And here's what we learned. So these birds were using separate sites for their daytime and nighttime activity. So during the day, they were out in the salt marshes and mudflats feeding. And you can see those sites marked by the yellow triangles on the map. And then at night, they went to more isolated areas like sand spits and islands to roost, just like the adults that I mentioned earlier. So you can see we identified two main nocturnal roosts, Jeremy Point and Wellfleet. It's kind of that northern blue dot. And then Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, which is the southern blue dot in Chatham, Massachusetts. We also learned that these nocturnal roosts are connected to specific foraging grounds. So all of those birds roosting on Jeremy Point were feeding in the Wellfleet marshes, and all the birds roosting in Monomoy were feeding in the marshes along the Nantucket Sound. We were also able to map these birds' daily commutes. So these birds would commute anywhere from 5 to 20 kilometers one way to get from their roost site and their daytime feeding grounds. So by identifying these important nocturnal roosts for juvenile Whimbrel, we were able to start a long-term monitoring program for them, just as we have going for the adults. So juvenile night roost counts began in 2022. Here's a little table with some of the preliminary data. And you can see we have a high count of 94 juvenile Whimbrel in 2022, and that's total for both roosts. So once the birds had their fill of fiddler crabs on Cape Cod, they departed to continue their southbound migrations. So all of these birds took nonstop flights across the Atlantic, which you can see in that map. Each different color is a different bird. So these nonstop flights took an average of 3 days to travel an average of 3,400 kilometers. And remember, this is nonstop. And it's particularly impressive because Whimbrel do not glide like some other birds do. So they have to flap this entire way. So it's pretty mind-blowing that these young birds can do this. And they all made landfall safely, either in the Caribbean or in Venezuela. So not every bird landed directly in what would be their non-breeding grounds where they would spend the winter. Some made a few stopovers at sites along the way. But eventually 4 birds made it to their non-breeding grounds. And these are the green squares on the map. They include the British Virgin Islands, Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname. And these birds transmitted from these sites anywhere from 2.5 months to 2.5 years. So 3 of these birds stopped transmitting on the site, and 1 left to begin its very first northbound migration. So I'll tell you a little bit about their ecology on the non-breeding grounds. Based on discussions and reaching out to biologists that live in these areas, we know that they use mangroves and mudflats as their habitat. And through the tracking data, we found that they use the same areas during the night as they do during the day. So this is different from what they were doing on Cape Cod. We also documented delayed maturation in 2 of the birds. So delayed maturation is when a bird spends longer than 1 calendar year on the non-breeding grounds, instead of heading to the breeding grounds the following spring like the adults do. So we had 1 bird spend 2.5 years in Venezuela, and 1 bird spend 1.5 years in the British Virgin Islands. Another interesting behavior that we documented was a couple of the birds took forays or brief trips outside of their non-breeding home ranges. One of the birds in Suriname made a 2-week trip to Brazil before returning to its home base in Suriname. And then I'll show you a map of this other bird. So these are our British Virgin Islands bird, and you can see that it spent a majority of its time, at about a year and a half, on the British Virgin Islands. And periodically during this year and a half, they took very brief trips to the surrounding islands. I'm talking 1 to 7 day trips. We're not 100% sure the reasoning for it. Maybe it was just exploratory. Maybe since it was living on such small islands, it was trying to find additional resources on these neighboring islands. We're not 100% sure, but it sure is interesting. So we're going to stick with this island hopping bird because it's also the only one that initiated its northbound migration. So here's its entire route. It's after spending a year and a half on the British Virgin Islands. It flew across the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, made a brief stopover in Louisiana, and then went to Mexico for about 20 days. And then from there, it launched off, probably headed to the mid-continent flyway to get up to the breeding grounds. Unfortunately, it did lose transmission over central Louisiana, so that's kind of where its story ended for us. So what did we learn from tracking these 8 juvenile Whimbrel over the past decade? So for one, it highlighted the importance of Cape Cod as a staging area for these birds because it prepares them for their very first nonstop flight across the Atlantic. So it's crucial for them to get enough food to eat and enough rest at this site so they are well prepared for this long and dangerous flight. We're also able to connect the Cape Cod site to the Caribbean, sites along that north coast of South America, and the mid-continent flyway. And the study also showed the importance of non-breeding sites to these young birds. This is because they can spend over a year at these sites before they even attempt to head north to breed. So it's really important that these birds are surviving and making it back to those breeding grounds. Also, all of these sites that we identified can be used for future study, monitoring, and protection. That initial tracking study also laid the groundwork for the next generation of juvenile Whimbrel tracking. So we'll be deploying 12 more transmitters on Cape Cod juvenile Whimbrel between 2024 and 2026. This will supplement our initial study that was from 2015 to 2022, and it can help us better understand more sites that the birds are using, or if there's sites being used by more than one bird, that'll be good to know. And it'll give us some more information about their survival. So we kicked off this expanded effort in 2024, and I'll give you a little sneak peek about how it's been going. So we caught not only a beautiful sunset, but also the very first Whimbrel on our very first trapping attempt. So that was really exciting for us. This was at the Jeremy Point Nocturnal Roost. During our scouting visits to the site, we were regularly having about 23 juvenile Whimbrels flying in to roost about the same time every night. So we did a little mapping and we were able to correctly predict where to put the traps. And that enabled us to catch a bird on our very first try. However, shifting tides made it a little difficult to predict where to place the traps during the following nights. So we shifted our focus to trapping on the daytime foraging grounds in West Dennis and in Wellfleet. And we finally found success again towards the end of our second week. This was at a daytime high tide roost at Fox Point in Wellfleet. There was extremely high tides during that week, and they were pushing birds out of their salt marsh feeding areas so they could roost at these dry, beachy areas. And despite times of even torrential downpours, we managed to deploy our remaining 3 transmitters. And here's a photo of a very pleased Shiloh with one of those birds. So then we just had to sit back and wait for the data to come in. So all the birds continued to feed in the Wellfleet marshes and roost at Jeremy Point for another 3 to 4 weeks. One bird stopped transmitting on Cape Cod, and the other 3 began their transatlantic flights. Unfortunately for one, it ran into Hurricane Milton during its southbound flight across the Atlantic. So as shorebird biologists, we know that storms pose a threat to migrating birds, particularly when they're making these long over water flights. But it was still tragic to watch this young bird just hopelessly fly into the storm. It did fight its way through the storm for quite some time, but it ultimately lost transmission just east of Bermuda. But the other two birds did make it safely to the north coast of Venezuela. So one of the birds made landfall on some small uninhabited islands just off the coast of Venezuela, and unfortunately stopped transmitting after 2 days. The other bird landed on the mainland at a known shorebird stopover site, and it spent about 2 months there in habitat that consisted of salt marshes and mud flats. Then around December, it headed east, and we'll take a closer look at this eastern site. So the site that it landed at is a large wetland complex adjacent to a large petrochemical complex. So a very interesting site. Another interesting thing about it is that it's the same site that 2 of our juveniles from the initial study used. So it's really exciting to see 3 different juveniles using this site. This bird is still transmitting, so its story has not concluded yet. So stay tuned to hear more about what happens to this bird in hopefully the coming months. So that wraps up what's going on with our juvenile Whimbrels on Cape Cod to present day. Some of the next steps that we have, as I mentioned before, we'll be deploying 8 more transmitters in 2025 and 2026 on juvenile Whimbrel and Cape Cod. So like I said before, stay tuned to hear more juvenile Whimbrel stories. And we'll also continue to do our annual nocturnal roost counts for both adult and juvenile Whimbrel. As for the bigger picture, our data that we've been collecting on these juvenile birds, as well as data from our partner studies, will all contribute to a demographic model that will help us better understand Whimbrel populations. Another thing that the Whimbrel Working Group has been doing is that they'll be assessing some of these important Whimbrel sites that have been identified through tracking data. And actually, Alan, Shiloh, and some of our partners just were recently in Brazil doing just that earlier this month. So look forward to maybe another small sit on that. And the Whimbrel Working Group is also working to update the Whimbrel Conservation Plan. And just to wrap it up, all this research that we've been doing will help us better understand the main drivers of Whimbrel population decline so that we can address the causes and recover Whimbrel populations.
Fantastic, Liana.
Yeah, and I guess that's it. So thanks again for joining, and I suppose it's time for questions, right?
Time for questions. Everyone can feel free to put the questions into the Q&A box. And I'm going to kick it off with a question. I am curious, Liana, how, with regard, you mentioned that the Whimbrels, the juvenile Whimbrels are not able to glide. They have to flap the whole time, which sounds exhausting. Is there a particular reason for that, or why?
So it's something, I'm not sure the underlying reason why, but it's a common feature of shorebirds in general. They tend to flap the entire way. They also, I'll mention, can't stop and float on the water like a seagull would do. So they're really flapping that entire 3+ days.
Okay.
So that's a lot of extra energy that they're expending because of that, which is why it's important that they're able to refuel at their
that makes sense. I have a question, except the funny thing is it says from Patty, can you pronounce, is it Phaetopus again? She's asking, which I'm sure I'm butchering.
Oh, the scientific name,
yes.
Numinius Phaeopus. Hopefully I'm getting that right.
I'm sure you are. I have a question from Susan. It says, when a Whimbrel stops transmitting, does it have to mean that the bird is no longer alive, or is it just as likely that something potentially happened to the transmitter?
That's a really great question. So there's a few different things that can happen to cut the lifespan of a transmitter short. So it could be just a technical issue and the transmitter, something goes wrong and it dies. It could be that the battery died. As I mentioned, these are solar powered. So if anything covers up the solar panel, sometimes the bird's feathers might cover it up. Or if they're spending time in a more shaded habitat, like when they're on the non-breeding grounds, they can be in mangroves, which are small trees, and the tag can be not getting enough light, and that can cause the transmitter to die. They could potentially fall off if something were to happen to the harness, and if it falls off and lands face down, it's not getting enough light. And then, yes, unfortunately, sometimes it does mean that the bird died as well. So it's really difficult to know for sure what happened, but we can sometimes use some clues to help us figure it out. Some of these will send us data about the battery level, so we can, when we get all the data points back, it can tell us what the battery level of the tag was when it went offline. So that's one clue. In the case of the bird that got lost in the storm, I think it's pretty safe to say that it didn't make it, unfortunately. So we try to use clues to figure out what happened, but
A little bit of shorebird detective work.
yes.
All right, actually, someone else asked that same question, and there's a question here that says, is there a sense of what percentage of juvenile birds stay for more than one winter? I guess those ones that you mentioned that were kind of hanging about.
Yeah, so that's also a great question. And hopefully with this expanded tracking effort, we can learn more about that. But out of the birds that we tracked, that initial study period, 2 of them stayed there out of the 4 that overwintered. But the other 2 birds didn't transmit long enough to know if they were gonna stay longer than 1 year.
Okay.
And this delayed maturation is something that's been seen in other species as well. So I'd have to, look into what the other species say to know more about the percentage of
Okay, yeah, got
that
it.
are actually doing that. But we hopefully we can learn more about this process in Whimbrel.
Still more work to do. That's
Yeah.
why you're doing it, right? Let's see. I have a question that says, what and how often do the Whimbrels eat en route and when they arrive at their southern destination? So what do they eat and how often do they eat along the way?
So my expertise, of course, is Cape Cod, but I do know of some of what they eat at some of the other sites. Before they make it to Cape Cod, some of them stop over in Atlantic Canada and even Maine, and they'll actually feed in blueberry thickets there, which is pretty interesting. On Cape Cod, I mentioned they're eating primarily fiddler crabs, but probably some other seafood. And during these stopover times during their migration, they're eating pretty much as much as they can. They want to be able to fatten up, so they can make the rest of their migration. So they're eating almost constantly, except for maybe during high tides when their foraging grounds are covered up by water. So in that case, they'll just head for high ground and wait it out and get some rest and maybe preen. And on the non-breeding grounds, I know they're also eating kind of marine invertebrates like fiddler crabs, but their actual habits there, I'm not as familiar with, but maybe there'll be another small sit on that.
Sounds good. We'll schedule it. Let's see. There's a comment that says, presumably the birds gorge on crabs prior to departure, and that is reflected by seeing fat reserves weight increase when the birds are banded. I think that follows along with what you were just saying.
Yes, that is a way to tell, when a bird's getting ready to blast off is their weight. They'll start off kind of with their fat reserves depleted from their previous flight. They'll fatten up and then they'll head off for the next leg of their journeys.
Got it. Next, there's a comment and a question about the hunting. Louise says, I remember when there were first political problems in Venezuela and the people were going hungry, and she was worried about the shorebird hunting that might increase. And let's see, Peter Hicklin from CWS visited in the 80s and saw that many people living along the coast had bowls filled with bird bands. Oh my goodness. Is there a plan to investigate current and historic hunting?
Yeah, so through the Whimbrel working group, we have partners who are working in places where shorebird hunting still happens.
Mhm.
So they're kind of on the ground talking with the local communities, and that's definitely something that the Whimbrel working group is working to try to address.
Yeah, I was wondering if the hunting, it had to do with food, not feathers, yes?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Like I think in the 1920s here, there were issues in the States about people collecting, hunting birds for their feathers, which was a thing.
Yeah. And they were, like I mentioned before, there's those hunting journals. Whimbrel and other shorebirds were hunted in the
Mhm.
US, and Cape Cod and Nantucket were actually kind of some hot spots for the hunting.
I mean, it makes sense if there's a
But
lot of them around, right?
yeah, but with that
Yeah,
Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it's no longer legal.
okay. There's a question in the chat that says, do you have a picture of the traps? And I'm gonna add on to that and say, what was it like when you trapped your first bird? Was it nerve-wracking? How was it?
Oh gosh, yeah, I probably should have gotten a photo of the traps in there. They are very hard to see, which is why the birds will walk right into them. But
Mm-hmm.
they're basically just like little loops of fishing line, maybe like, yeah, not even as big as your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And we put a lot of them down in the areas where the birds are feeding. So they kind of are more likely to put a foot through one of those loops. And then yeah, it's like a little mini noose, and it just
Mm-hmm.
tightens
And
around their leg.
does everyone have to have a hand on the end of the loops, or how does it?
Oh, good question. We stake them
Okay.
into the ground. They're all connected to like a baseline,
Okay, got it.
and then we stake that into the ground so they're secured. And um, and I have only been with Manamit for a little over a year and a half now. So I did my first Whimbrel trapping last year in Texas, actually. So it's still fresh in my mind. And it's definitely an experience. You need a lot of patience. It takes a lot of strategy, but also luck to get the birds in the right place and to get a bird foot to go through one of those loops. But when
Mhm.
you do catch a bird, it is really exciting. It's just like, go. And
All
we
right, that's what I'm here for.
try to do everything as swiftly and calmly as possible so we can get the bird in and out as stress-free as possible. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. Evan says, is there a way to determine which breeding populations the marked birds are coming from? And he says it would be cool to know if they return to where they hatched or whether there's a gene flow between breeding populations, says our own Evan Dalton.
oh, well. So if the birds were to continue their northbound migration, we might get some insights into which populations they're coming from based on what breeding grounds they go back to. There is going to be, I think, a genetic study on these birds. We actually collected just a couple of small blood samples from these juvenile birds this past year for them to use in kind of a genetic mapping project to better understand which birds are from which populations.
That's cool.
Yeah, and yeah.
Let's see. Brian Harrington asks, many kinds of shorebirds forage nocturnally. Do Whimbrels on Cape Cod feed at night?
Yeah, so they're at their night roosts, kind of on those sandy spits. They're likely still feeding if they can. I haven't been out there to observe it myself, and it's hard to tell with just the tracking data that we have, but I'm sure that's something we could figure out.
Maybe
If we
the question is maybe. It's okay not to know, not to have all the answers. Let's see. I have let's see, one last question here. And that is, Susan wants to know. Oh, I have a couple of questions. Is it possible to let us know where and when you're working on Cape Cod so we can watch you? Is that a thing? Do you want a crowd? It seems like I don't know if you I don't know.
Yeah, so it is very where we're trapping can vary like widely, even like within a day, depending on the weather and the tides and where the birds are. So it's often hard to predict where and when we'll be at a specific site.
Mhm.
Um, And we do tend to keep it, sometimes we'll have a few people along to check it out, but we do want to make sure that things are it's a calm atmosphere for when we do catch the birds. So probably not a huge crowd. Every now and then we'll have a few guests though. So you never know.
Maybe we'll try and take some video for Susan at some point in the future, and then we can show you
Yeah.
that.
And then, we always accommodate passerbys as well. If people are
Mhm.
coming by who live in the neighborhood, or we always let them know what's going on. So
And people have been kind down the Cape to let us use their property, correct?
yes. So a big
Yeah.
thank you to all the property owners out there that have let us trap on their properties. We spent a lot of time in West Dennis at a private property this past year, and we're really grateful to the property owner.
Okay, we have one more question before we wrap it up, and that is, with the decline in the Whimbrel population, can we presume that the fiddler crab population have increased? And if so, is there any data on whether that contributes to salt marsh bank erosion? Okay.
That's
So
a good question.
yeah.
I'm not an expert on the fiddler crabs, but I
Mhm.
was just at a really interesting conference focused on the Wellfleet Bay
Oh,
this
cool.
past fall, and there was a presentation about the increase in the fiddler crab populations, and they are native species, but for some reason their populations have increased and are starting to maybe have some negative impacts on the already eroding and subsiding salt marshes out there.
Okay.
And I do remember them mentioning that the decrease in predators, such as various types of birds, could contribute to that increase in fiddler crabs.
Makes sense. Everything's interconnected. I want to thank everyone for all of those questions. That was a really nice presentation, Liana. Thank you so much. And for those of you who might not know, we at Manomet, we recently kicked off a new campaign to bring visibility to our shorebird work. It's called No Boundaries, the Magic and Wonder of Shorebirds, and highlights our 9 flagship shorebird species, of which the Whimbrel is one. And to learn more about these species and the campaign, I will put the link in the chat so everyone can read about all of those species. And if you enjoyed today, we'd love your support for our work directly with the donation online if you haven't already. If you want more Manomet, please join the conversation on our socials or visit our events page online. We have some fun new events, including a watercolor night and a bird carving workshop. And you don't want to miss the next small sit with Manomet's VP of Flyways, Dr. Rob Clay, titled Weird and Wonderful Shorebirds. And again, another thank you to Liana and her great presentation. I know I learned a lot. That wraps up another edition of the Small Sit. Thank you for joining us, and we at Manomet Conservation Sciences wish you a great day. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks, Liana.
Thank you.